Welcome to this edition of Head to Head. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and this is episode number 272 of the podcast. And on this episode, I'm talking about big league outfielders Cody Bellinger and Christian Yelich. Because for a brief period of time, the two best players in baseball were outfielders Christian Yelich of the Milwaukee Brewers and Cody Bellinger, who at the time played for the LA Dodgers. Yelich won NL MVP in 2018 with a league-leading .336 batting average, 36 home runs, and 110 RBIs, while Bellinger took home the award in 2019 with a .305 average, 47 homers, and 115 RBIs. We all thought at the time that these two were the new long-term faces of baseball, that they would be right up there with Mike Trout, but in the following years, both suffered a precipitous drop-off. For Bellinger, his batting average was a big problem. In 2020, he hit .239, and in 2021, he hit .165, and the Dodgers were avoiding playing him against left-handed pitchers. And in the last 3 seasons, he had only 41 home runs. For Yelich, who has 2 batting titles, in 2020, he hit .205, in 21, .248, and in 2022, he hit .252, and in the last 3 seasons, he's hit only 35 home runs. And listen, it's not that rare for this to happen in baseball. There are many former MVPs who have struggled after winning the award, but for it to happen to two of the biggest young stars in the game, that's the rarity. And for it to happen to them at the same time, to two young stars that everyone was rooting for, it's insane and shows just how difficult baseball as a sport is. You don't see MVP basketball players struggle for years at a time, or in football. In baseball, it's impossible to bank on anyone being consistent for years to come. Yes, there are players like Mike Trout and Mookie Betts who every year you are going to put up numbers, but for so many others who win MVPs, they go through declines. It's just so rare to see two guys decline before they ever hit the age of 30. And that's something that's common in baseball. When somebody has success at a young age, you think that you haven't seen their best yet. Like when I saw Dustin Pedroia win MVP after his rookie season where he won Rookie of the Year, I obviously thought that Dustin Pedroia was going to continue to be one of the best players in baseball, and that didn't happen. He remained pretty consistent, but I had already seen the best of Dustin Pedroia. There are other guys. Fred Lynn in 1975 won Rookie of the Year and MVP. Ichiro won Rookie of the Year and MVP. Yes, Ichiro is a Hall of Fame player, but you really could make the case that Ichiro's first year in the big leagues was the very best Ichiro. We just think that because these guys are so young, they're going to continue to grow. There are those players who shine for a brief period at a young age, and that's the best they're ever going to deliver. Another example of this is former Chicago Cub Kris Bryant. Kris Bryant won Rookie of the Year, and then he won MVP, and now he's on the Colorado Rockies, and he's not putting up the numbers that he was putting up when he was young. Now he's dealing with injuries, but he's not the same player when he's on the field. This was a guy who could play any position, hit 25 to 30 homers, and drive in 90 to 100. And now he's playing in one of the hittingest, friendliest parks in all of baseball, and he's not putting up numbers. We might have already seen the best of Kris Bryant. He's not going to be one of those all-time great players we thought he was going to be, and that's something that happens in baseball. Guys can peak extremely early, and these two, Yelich and Bellinger, have largely been forgotten until, that is, this season in 2023, where both have had bounce-back seasons in a big way. Yelich is currently hitting .290 with 16 home runs and 64 RBIs, while Bellinger is hitting .327 with 17 home runs and 56 RBIs. These two will forever be connected because they were elite at the same time, they struggled at the same time, and are having a resurgence at the same time. I don't think that these two are back on track to being the future Hall of Famers some thought they would become. They are nowhere near the top 10 players they used to be, but the fact that they are back to being really good is a great story because baseball is filled with players who never have these kind of comebacks. That's something that's so interesting about baseball players struggling. At first, you're like, what on earth happened to Christian Yelich? He fell off of a cliff, and that's what you talk about. But then years go by, and you start to feel bad for the players. I felt bad for Cody Bellinger when the LA Dodgers didn't bring him back this past season. I thought he was going to become an all-time great member of the Dodgers. That's a great organization. They develop young players. This guy became an MVP candidate. He was up there with Clayton Kershaw as one of the faces of the franchise, but because of his diminishing play, he's no longer a member of the Dodgers. And the Dodgers aren't bad for not bringing back Cody Bellinger. He wasn't the same player, but it's a sad story nonetheless. Nobody's on the wrong. I don't know why Cody Bellinger struggled in his last remaining years with the LA Dodgers. We're probably never going to know the real story. Was it his swing? Was it the injuries? Why is he having a resurgence with the Cubs? That's what's so great about baseball, is that you're never going to know the full story. Is it because when these guys had success when they were so young, it gave the league time to figure them out? What were their adjustments? Maybe Cody Bellinger or Yelich wasn't adjusting well. I find that hard to believe for guys who won MVPs and batting titles, but it might be just as simple as that. Christian Yelich, unlike Cody Bellinger, is on the same team. He's still on the Milwaukee Brewers, and unlike Bellinger, Yelich got a massive contract. Christian Yelich is making $26 million a year until 2028. The Brewers paid him believing he would continue to be their best franchise star, and he hasn't. This is also a team that signed Ryan Braun to a big deal, and he struggled for a variety of reasons. This team has had bad luck with giving their stars big contracts. I mean, if one wanted to simplify the issue, maybe Christian Yelich got comfortable after getting that massive deal by the Milwaukee Brewers. But I do think injuries are at play here. And again, he had such a great peak. He was having those great Septembers. He was winning an MVP. He won 2 batting titles. He wasn't going to remain that good forever. But still, the drop-off has been drastic. Nobody expected Cody Bellinger and Christian Yelich to every year win MVPs and batting titles, but we thought that they were going to be consistent players who would continually make All-Star games or eventually be Hall of Fame players. There are all-time great players who had off seasons. There are not all-time great players who had years and years of not being the same player, and that's something that has happened to Cody Bellinger and Christian Yelich. They went through a period where they weren't even half as good as they used to be. That's what's drastic about this situation. They fell off the face of the earth. They weren't even something anybody wanted to talk about, and I think that's why people ignored them for so many years, because it's kind of uncomfortable to talk about athletes who are nowhere near as good as they used to be, and it's not because of age. It's easy to look at a player who's 35 years old and go, oh, he's no longer that same player because he's no longer in his prime. These guys are still supposed to be in their prime, and I think for that reason, nobody wants to talk about their struggles. And part of that is because nobody really understands why they were struggling in the first place. Only Cody Bellinger and Christian Yelich truly know why the last few years have been rough. Let's talk about Cody Bellinger, who is now a member of the Chicago Cubs, and there were talks he would be dealt at the trade deadline to a contender, but instead is still on the Cubs, who are in the chase for a wild card spot. Bellinger currently has a .327 batting average, the 4th best in the National League. Again, this is a guy who at one point was hitting .165 for an entire year. One would imagine after the year he's having, Bellinger will be a sought-after free agent. I'm not saying a team should give him a big deal, but I would definitely want him on my team. He's an elite defender who is back to hitting like he's an all-star all-star caliber player. One thing about these two players that doesn't get talked about enough is how big of a loss it was for the sport to lose both of them at the same time. I mean, these two were in a commercial together. They were fighting for the MVP. Christian Yelich and Cody Bellinger were going to be building blocks for the future of the sport. They were right up there with Mike Trout and Mookie Betts, among others, as the best players in the sport. I mean, the sport to lose two young stars like this is catastrophic, and I think they really could have used them because people were paying attention to the Milwaukee Brewers when Christian Yelich was at his best. Yes, Cody Bellinger was playing for the Dodgers. The Dodgers are always going to be a mainstream team with mainstream stars, but Christian Yelich not playing like Christian Yelich was a huge loss for the Milwaukee Brewers because it basically made it so that most of us could ignore the Milwaukee Brewers even if they were a good team. I was really only paying attention to them because of Christian Yelich. He was that kind of star. You were amazed by what he was doing. He was like a smaller looking dude who was putting up incredible power numbers. He was a nice player with the Marlins, but then he became a transcendent player with the Milwaukee Brewers. It was a great story. It was a great story for the sport, and I believed he was going to continue to be better and become a Hall of Fame caliber player. And the story isn't going to end like that because of this rough past few years for him. And the truth of the matter is this: we really only talk about all-time great players who win MVPs. Like when we look back at MVP seasons or Cy Young seasons, we talk about Hall of Famers. Like we're going to look back at the career of Mike Trout. We're going to look back at the career of Justin Verlander. Those are two all-time great players who are going to be unanimous Hall of Fame players. We don't look back at young players who had a great peak. Like I look at guys like Grady Sizemore and Jacoby Ellsbury. Those were two guys who were electric when I was growing up, but they have largely been forgotten because they didn't have a great 10-year run of being great. They had a short run of being 5-tool players. Jacoby Ellsbury at one point was the most exciting player on the Boston Red Sox. He had power, he could steal bases, then he went to the New York Yankees and he became invisible because he wasn't the same player. And for Grady Sizemore, he went through injury issues. Those two have largely been forgotten, but they were so good during my early years of watching baseball that I won't forget them. And I feel like that's what's happened to Cody Bellinger and Christian Yelich. People have forgotten how good they were during that 2-year run. I mean, it's crazy that baseball made that commercial with the both of them. They were trying to turn them into the modern day Larry Bird, Magic Johnson situation, and baseball was banking on the fact that they would continue to battle for MVPs for years to come, and sadly, that didn't happen. And I can't imagine what it's been like for these two to go through these last few rough seasons where they haven't been the same players. I mean, that's something that's far more common in football, because in football you don't have a 10-year run. But in baseball, there's a history of guys having 10 to 15-year careers that are fantastic from start to finish. These two have gone through a rough stretch that not a lot of people have gone through, and you have to wonder, have they ever contacted each other about their struggles? Because these two are going to be connected till the end of time in the sport of baseball, because look, they started together, they had that great run, they were competing for MVPs, they were winning batting titles, they were making the All-Star game, they were the best players on their team. Yelich for the Brewers, Bellinger for the Dodgers. Then they struggled during the same time period, and now they're having a bounce back in the same season. It's an incredible story that not enough people are talking about. I mean, forgotten MVPs coming back to being really good players. Again, they're not having fantastic all-time great seasons. Cody Bellinger had a unreal August, and if he leads the Chicago Cubs to the postseason, it's a great story, but he's not going to be an MVP. He's not going to win a batting title. He's not going to be the Cody Bellinger Bellinger he was with the LA Dodgers, but he's starting to show how talented he is again. And the same for Christian Yelich. I mean, he's back to being one of the best players on the Milwaukee Brewers. The best outcome for the story, of course, would be for them to continue to be consistent for years to come, but I think this year enough is good enough for the story to end, because they were not on my radar. I had largely forgotten about Christian Yelich and Cody Bellinger. I no longer had expectations for them to be good. I was intrigued with the Chicago Cubs signing Cody Bellinger because I did believe a change of scenery might do him wonders. I did not believe he was going to bat .327 with the Chicago Cubs. Nobody could have imagined that. Honestly, I've always felt worse for Christian Yelich because he got the big contract, and I don't think there's anything worse to being that high-priced, overpaid athlete. That's what most people were going to categorize him as if he continued to go down the route of underperforming for whatever reason, injuries and all. He was going to be labeled as somebody who had a bad contract. That he wasn't the best player on the Brewers was a travesty. Now he's back to being a really good player, and I want him to continue to be a really good player. These two are just an example of not everyone that has all-time great seasons or runs become all-time great players. That sometimes we take that for granted, how hard it is to be guys like Albert Pujols, Miguel Cabrera, who year in and year out hit 300, hit 35 homers, and drive in 100. That's not easy to do, and that's what makes them all-time great players. Again, only 1% of baseball players make the MLB Hall of Fame. At the end of this season, Cody Bellinger should definitely win Comeback Player of the Year. Christian Yelich, of course, should be a candidate, but what Cody Bellinger is doing with the Chicago Cubs is phenomenal. Everyone had written him off as just some guy who was no longer the same player. Nobody thought the Chicago Cubs would be in the playoff chase, and nobody thought that Cody Bellinger was going to hit .327. Again, I cannot say this enough. This is a guy who hit .165 for an entire season with the LA Dodgers. I mean, there are so many guys who would have just given up after it not working out with the LA Dodgers. The fact that he just, a year after leaving the Dodgers, is having this season is one of the best recent comebacks in baseball history. And Christian Yelich, of course, is also having an amazing comeback. But Cody Bellinger, if he had not succeeded with the Cubs this year, would probably be out of the sport of baseball. Not only is he having a comeback season, but he's giving himself a chance to make a lot of money this offseason. The MLB Comeback Player of the Year award should definitely go to Cody Bellinger. I do believe he went through more than Christian Yelich. I mean, Cody Bellinger was basically benched by the LA Dodgers. I mean, think about that. He was benched, a guy who won an MVP with the team, a guy who would hit over 40 homers in a season, being benched and not playing against left-handed pitchers. Again, maybe that was warranted due to his play, but that's not something that's easy to digest, especially when it's for the LA Dodgers, one of baseball's most sacred teams, and they basically, I hate to say it, replaced him with guys like Mookie Betts and Freddie Freeman. That's why I think it's kind of harder on Cody Bellinger than it was on Christian Yelich. I mean, Christian Yelich is playing for the Milwaukee Brewers. They gave him that big contract. He's going to continue to be with the Milwaukee Brewers till the end of that deal. And it's not like if he had left the team, they were going to replace him with another star player right away. Milwaukee is a smaller market team. Cody Bellinger struggling with the Dodgers was probably the biggest story in LA at the time. This guy went through a lot when it comes to a big market team, and he had big market struggles with that team. When you struggle with the Yankees, Dodgers, and Red Sox, it's different than when you struggle with the Milwaukee Brewers. They have a really good fan base, but they're not going to get mad at Christian Yelich. They're not going to boo. I'm sure Cody Bellinger went through some booing when he wasn't that same guy, when he wasn't that MVP caliber player. I'm almost positive he thought he was going to be a Dodger for life, the same way that Clayton Kershaw is going to end up being an LA Dodger for life. But that story is not how it played out. He's on the Chicago Cubs. He's had a career rebirth. So too has Christian Yelich. And I believe it's one of the best stories that's happened in baseball this year. And not enough people are talking about it. And at the end of the day, I hope this is the beginning of a great second act for Cody Bellinger and Christian Yelich. I don't think they're going to end up being the Hall of Fame players that some of us thought they were going to end up being, but I hope they have great ends to their astonishing careers. And it's worth pointing out that both of them are now fighting for the NL Central. They are in the same division. Yelich for the Milwaukee Brewers and Bellinger for the Chicago Cubs. One of these two could be on the team that ends up winning the NL Central, and of course would end up being a big part of that team winning that division. That's not something any of us thought would be the case at the beginning of the season. Thanks for listening to this edition of Head to Head. I'm Cam McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so please rate, review, and subscribe.